He almost didn't go to her funeral, and that is the one truth Walter Brooks carried alone for the rest of his days. The one secret he never whispered to his children or his grandchildren or the kind neighbors who came with casseroles and soft voices and sat in the living room saying the things people say when words have stopped being enough. He had sat alone in his car in the driveway that morning, 79 years old, his hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel the way they always did now in the cold. And he had stared through the windshield at the oak tree Eleanor had planted the year their youngest was born. And he had thought about 62 years of a life shared with a woman he had loved badly for too long before he finally, mercifully, learned to love her well. He thought about the silences between them that had stretched on for days like something with weight and texture. He thought about the words he had said in anger that lived in the air of that house long after the argument was over. He thought about the night Eleanor had looked at him across the kitchen table with no anger in her eyes, only honesty, and said quietly that there had been at least 3 times she had almost walked away from him for good, and how the absence of anger in her voice had made it hurt so much more than anger ever could have. The sun was just beginning to come up over the mountains that morning, and the light fell soft and gold across the hood of the car, and across the yard, and across the oak tree, the kind of early light that makes even the most ordinary things look as though they have always mattered and always will. Walter pressed one hand flat against the cold glass of the window and looked at that tree for a long moment, thinking about the woman who had planted it, thinking about everything he had almost thrown away without ever meaning to. "I'm coming, Ellie," he said quietly to no one. "I'm coming." He had 62 years with that woman, and there were at least 5 times it could have ended before it became 62 years at all. This is the story he never told anyone until now, the real one, not the polished version that gets told at anniversary parties and golden celebration dinners, but the true one, the one with all the damage still visible in it, the one that might actually help someone who is standing right now in the middle of the same mistakes he made and does not yet know how close they are to losing everything. Walter James Brooks was born in 1946 in the mountains of western North Carolina, the second son of a coal worker who loved his family the way mountain men love things, quietly and completely and without much decoration, and a seamstress mother who had enough warmth in her for the whole county if the county had ever thought to ask. He grew up watching his father come home in the evenings with the black dust of the mines still in the deep creases of his hands, tired in a way that went all the way down to the bone, and still find it in himself to pull his wife into the kitchen and dance with her to whatever was playing low on the radio, because some things mattered more than exhaustion.
Walter watched that and believed, the way young people believe things before life has a chance to complicate them, that love was something that simply arrived and stayed, that it was a condition you fell into the way you fall into sleep, naturally and without effort, and that the falling was the hard part and everything after was just living inside the warmth of it. He did not understand yet that love is not a place you arrive at. It is something you build with your hands every single day, and that you can lose it just as gradually and just as quietly as you built it, through nothing more dramatic than inattention and pride and the slow accumulation of all the things you meant to say but never did. Eleanor Grace Hardin grew up 12 miles away and carried inside herself a deep and lifelong belief that if she planned carefully enough, organized thoroughly enough, held every piece of the world around her in its proper place with both hands and enough determination, then nothing important could fall apart. She kept her feelings tucked close to her chest the way careful people keep valuable things, not because she didn't feel deeply, but because feeling deeply had always seemed to her like something that could be used against you if you weren't watchful about who you showed it to. She did not understand yet that the same wall she had built to keep the pain out was also keeping the love from ever getting all the way in, and that someday the man she married would stand on the other side of that wall for years, knocking, wondering why she seemed so far away even when she was right beside him. They met at a church social in the summer of 1962, when Walter was 16 and wearing a shirt that belonged to his older brother and was 2 sizes too large for him, and Eleanor was 15 and had spent the better part of that morning making sure every single detail of her appearance was exactly where she intended it to be. He crossed the room and asked her to dance, and she told him she didn't really dance, and he told her that he didn't either, but that it hadn't stopped him yet. And she laughed, sudden and completely unguarded, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere real and doesn't ask permission first. And in that single, unplanned moment, something in the wall came open just wide enough for something true to slip through. They married in the spring of 1964. He was 18 years old, and she had just turned 17, and they stood in a small church with a borrowed ring and their whole lives ahead of them, and absolutely no understanding of what love was actually going to ask of them before it was through. The first mistake arrived so quietly that neither of them recognized it as a mistake at all, because it arrived wearing the face of hard work and sacrifice, which are things that look like virtue from the outside, even when they are being used as weapons from the inside.
Walter worked construction through 20 years of weather that had no patience for human comfort. Frozen ground in the deep of January, and July heat had pressed down on a man like something with a personal grudge, and he came home each evening carrying the weight of the day in his back and his hands and his knees. And somewhere in the unexamined space inside himself, he carried the quiet and unspoken belief that surviving all of that entitled him to be seen for it, recognized for it, appreciated for it in ways that Eleanor never quite managed to provide because she was too busy surviving her own war to notice his. 3 children under 10 years old, and a house that never stopped demanding things, and bills on the refrigerator that seemed to breathe with a life of their own, and school lunches made before the sun came up, and long nights with sick children, and dinners that burned because someone was crying, and the stove kept going regardless of what else was happening in that kitchen, and the endless, invisible labor of holding an entire family's interior world together with both hands, while the world outside gave her absolutely nothing for it. Not a paycheck, not a title, not even most days a simple acknowledgement from the man who came home each evening believing he was the one carrying everything. He thought he was carrying the family. She was drowning inside it, alone in plain sight, and he looked right at her every single day and did not see it. Resentment moved into that house the way cold moves through an old house in winter. Not all at once, not through any single dramatic opening, but through the cracks, slowly and patiently, until one day you realize you have been cold for so long that you have forgotten what it felt like to be warm. Then one evening their youngest daughter, 9 years old, with her hair tangled from sleep, and her eyes carrying the particular seriousness that children sometimes have when they see more than the adults around them want them to see, came downstairs in her nightgown and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at both of her parents and asked, in a voice that was quiet and genuine and completely without accusation, why they always sounded like enemies. Walter remembered the silence that followed that question for the rest of his life, because it was the loudest silence he had ever heard in that house, and because the child was right, and because being told the truth by someone who loves you and is too young to know how to soften it is one of the most painful and necessary things that can happen to a person.
He did not fully understand what had to change until several years later, when he fell from a ladder at a job site and shattered his hip and spent 6 months unable to do much of anything. And Eleanor worked double shifts and paid every bill and helped him bathe and sat beside him in the dark hours of the night when pain kept him awake and held his hand without saying a word. And not once, not a single time in all of those 6 months did she say, "Now you owe me," or
"Now you see what it is like," or any of the things that a person keeping score would eventually say. That was when Walter finally understood what love looks like when it has completely stopped keeping receipts. The second mistake was subtler and in some ways more damaging because it disguised itself as love while it was quietly doing the work of rejection. Walter and Eleanor were different people in ways that ran all the way down to the bone, and because they loved each other genuinely and completely, they each believed, in the generous and misguided way that people in love sometimes believe things, that the other person could be gently and lovingly improved into someone slightly more convenient to live with. She planned everything, down to the last detail, and needed structure the way some people need air. And he was a wanderer who made decisions at the last minute and believed that the best things in life happened when you weren't looking for them. And for years, they each treated these differences not as character defects that the other person simply hadn't gotten around to correcting yet. One Christmas Eve, Eleanor had arranged the evening with the quiet precision of someone who had been thinking about it for weeks. Dinner at 6, and church at 8, and gifts by the fire afterward. Every detail considered, every element in its proper place. And that afternoon, Walter loaded the children into the station wagon and drove them an hour away to see a neighborhood famous for its Christmas lights because he thought it would be a wonderful surprise. And the children pressed their faces to the cold glass and gasped at every house and came home glowing and full of joy. And Eleanor was standing alone in the kitchen with red eyes, and Walter looked at her and thought she was being unreasonable and said so, without cruelty, but also without any real attempt to understand. And he did not see that to Eleanor, his spontaneity was not freedom, it was chaos. It was the feeling of every careful thing she had built being cheerfully dismantled by someone who had never once noticed she had built it. It was standing alone in her own kitchen on Christmas Eve, feeling invisible in the home she had spent weeks preparing. And he chose being right over understanding any of that. And he still carries that night, not because the children didn't have a beautiful evening, but because his wife stood alone and felt like she didn't matter, and he was too proud and too certain of himself to see it. The third mistake nearly ended them entirely, and it was built out of nothing more than silence, which is the most dangerous building material in any marriage because it looks like peace while it is actually pressure, and pressure held long enough always finds a way out.
Eleanor hated conflict the way some people hate deep water. She went around it and held her breath waiting for it to pass, and when something hurt her, she buried it somewhere dark and quiet and told herself it would dissolve on its own. And it never dissolved. It only waited, patient and accumulating, until one ordinary winter evening when Walter forgot to pick up her prescription on the way home from work. A small thing, a simple human failure. And he walked through the door, and she looked at his empty hands, and something that had been pressed down for years broke open all at once, and she said things that had never been said out loud in that house, that she didn't feel seen, that she didn't feel like she mattered, that she had spent her whole life holding everyone else together, and she was drowning, and nobody noticed her standing there drowning. And Walter stood in the hallway with his coat still on and did not speak for a long time because he knew with everything in him that she was not talking about the prescription. She was talking about years. She was talking about every wound she had buried instead of spoken, every hurt she had smoothed over instead of named. And they stayed awake together until nearly 4 a.m, saying the honest and painful and long overdue things that silence had been storing
storing like kindling, waiting for a match. And what Walter learned that night was that silence does not protect a marriage. It only delays the damage and adds interest to it. And that small hurts spoken early are nothing compared to what they become when they are carried alone in the dark for years. The fourth mistake crept in on the back of ordinary life, which is always how it arrives, not through any dramatic failure, but through the quiet and gradual filling up of all available space with everything that is not the marriage itself. And by their 50s, Walter and Eleanor had stopped truly seeing each other. Their conversations had become logistics, appointments and grocery lists and utility bills. They were not fighting, which almost made it worse. They were simply existing side by side, like two rivers running parallel that had somewhere along the way forgotten they came from the same source. And then their closest friends, married 41 years, announced they were divorcing, and nobody had seen it coming. And Walter met the husband for coffee, and the man looked like something essential had gone out of him permanently. And he said, "We didn't fall out of love in one moment, Walter. We just stopped feeding it. And one morning we woke up, and there was nothing left." And Walter drove home that afternoon with those words sitting in his chest like a stone, and walked inside and found Eleanor reading in the living room, and sat across from her and said, "I don't want to talk about bills or appointments or anything practical. I just want to talk to you the way we used to." And she looked up from her book, and something in her eyes went soft in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. And slowly, carefully, the way two people learn to walk again after standing still for too long, they began.
Finding their way back to each other, making Friday nights their own again, sometimes pie at the small diner on Route 9 where they had stopped during a road trip in 1978, sometimes just the porch and 2 cups of coffee and the neighborhood settling into quiet around them. And their granddaughter once asked Eleanor why she and Grandpa always sat on the porch on Friday evenings no matter what, and Eleanor had smiled and said, "Because some things are worth protecting, sweetheart. And some people are worth showing up for every single week so they never forget that you chose them." And that answer had stayed with the granddaughter in the way that true things stay with you, quietly and permanently. The fifth mistake was perhaps the most corrosive of all, because it turned the person you had chosen to spend your life with into someone you were trying to defeat. And for years, every disagreement in that house was a courtroom where someone had to win and someone had to be proven wrong. And the year their oldest son came home changed everything. He was 43 years old and his business was gone and his marriage had collapsed. And he arrived at their door on a cold Tuesday evening with 2 bags and eyes that had gone somewhere far away and hollow. And Walter felt something break open in his chest when he saw his son standing there like that. And old habits rose immediately. Walter thought the boy needed firmness, and Eleanor thought he needed gentleness and time. And in earlier years, that difference alone would have become its own battle. But this time, their son's pain was larger than either of their pride. And so they listened to each other. Really listened, and they found a path that belonged to neither of them alone. And somewhere in that quiet and difficult process, they remembered something they had lost in the noise of all those years, that marriage was never supposed to be one person against another. It was always supposed to be 2 people standing together against the hard thing. And when you remember that, when you truly remember it and let it change the way you fight, the cruelty goes out of your arguments. You stop reaching for the words designed to wound. You stop trying to win and start trying to understand. And the 3 words that changed their marriage more than any others were simply, "Help me understand." 3 small words that opened more doors in that house than 40 years of arguing ever had. Walter sat in the front pew at Eleanor's funeral and held his youngest daughter's hand and looked at the woman lying there and thought about 62 years and all the ways they had nearly lost each other before they ever got there.
And he thought about the morning she had looked at him across the kitchen table and said, without anger, only honesty, that there were 3 times she had almost left, and he had looked back at her and said, I almost left too, and they had sat with that truth between them for a long moment, 2 old people in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and old wood and decades of a life built together. And then Eleanor had
reached across the table and put her hand over his, her fingers thin now and cool, the same hands that had held his children and written grocery lists in careful columns and once held his face while he wept in the dark. And they had sat there together in the quiet without saying anything more, because sometimes the most important thing 2 people can do after everything they have been through is simply stay. Walter still leaves the cabinet doors open. And he knows it now, because every morning he opens them out of a habit built over 62 years and then stands there in the quiet of the kitchen, remembering that there is no one left to remind him gently to close them, and the house is very quiet now, quieter than he ever imagined a house could become. But every morning he sits at the kitchen table with his coffee and he looks at the empty chair across from him, and he makes the same choice he made every day for 62 years. He chooses her. Again, even now, even in her absence, even in the silence, he chooses her. If you are sitting beside someone tonight, if there is someone in your life you have been too quiet with, or too proud with, or too busy for, please hear this, because the quiet in this house is real and it comes faster than anyone ever believes it will. And the only thing Walter Brooks wishes he could tell his younger self, the boy in the too big shirt who asked a girl to dance in the summer of 1962, is to stop keeping score, to say the hard thing before silence turns it into something that cannot be undone, to never stop choosing the person you chose on the day you had nothing but a borrowed ring and a whole life ahead of you that you did not yet know how to live. Because one day, the chair across from you will be empty and the house will be very quiet, and the only thing that will matter, the only thing that will have ever truly mattered, is whether you loved them well enough while they were still there to feel it. Walter Brooks learned that. He just wishes he had learnt it sooner. If this story reached something real inside you today, if it reminded you of someone you love or something you have been meaning to say, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are new to this channel, to the 11th hour last words, please subscribe. Because every story here is told slowly and honestly and with the deepest respect for the people who have lived long enough to know that time is the one thing you cannot get back and love is the one thing worth spending every last moment of it on.